The waltz wasn't invented for romance. It was invented to disguise interrogations under the cover of music. Alice knew this. She felt the heavy, damp heat of the ballroom, the suffocating scent of crushed lilies, and desperation, and the iron grip of the Duke's hand on her waist. "This dance means nothing," she muttered, her jaw tight, deliberately stepping a half-inch too close to his boot. He didn't flinch. He just pulled her closer, his breath hot and uneven against her temple. "Tell that to my mother watching." The air in the Abernathy ballroom tasted of burnt beeswax and too many bodies. Alice held her breath, pressing her shoulders against the flocked wallpaper of the alcove. If she breathed too deeply, the whalebone stays of her corset pinched a nerve under her ribs, a sharp, radiating ache she had lived with since 8 o'clock. It was now approaching midnight. She was 26. In the brutal arithmetic of the London season, she was practically a ghost. Men did not look at her. They looked through her to the giggling 19-year-olds draped in pale muslins behind her. Alice didn't mind. Being invisible meant she didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to smile until her cheeks cramped. She could stand here nursing a glass of warm, flat lemonade and watch the terrifying machinery of the marriage mart grind its gears. She wiped a bead of sweat from the back of her neck. The room was unbearably hot. The combined body heat of 300 aristocrats clad in heavy wool velvet and layers of silk had turned the grand hall into a swamp. Underneath the overpowering reek of expensive French lavender water and rose oils, there was the distinct sharp tang of stale sweat. It was entirely unromantic. Alice looked down at her gown. It was a dark bruised plum color. Her mother had insisted it was dignified. Alice knew it was just durable. It hid stains. It didn't snag easily. It was the dress of a woman who had surrendered. Across the room the crowd parted. Not cleanly, but with the messy, frantic shuffling of people trying to look casually deferential. Alaric Penhaligon, the Duke of Rothbury, was moving through the room. He was not a handsome man. He was too large for one. His shoulders were broad enough to make his impeccably tailored black evening coat look strained across the seams. His jaw was heavy, often shadowed by a perpetual stubble that suggested he shaved at dawn and gave up by noon. He looked entirely out of place among the delicate, preening dandies of the ton. He looked like a man who worked with his hands forced into a silk cravat. And he looked furious. Alice watched him from the safety of her alcove. He was being flanked. On his left, Lady Abernathy was speaking rapidly, gesturing toward a cluster of terrified-looking blonde girls. On his right, a few paces back, stood the Dowager Duchess of Rothbury. Augusta Penhaligon was a terrifying woman. She was thin, rigid, and wore black bombazine that seemed to absorb the light around her. She didn't hurt her son. She directed him with subtle, silent shifts of her cane. Alice took a sip of her terrible lemonade. She felt a brief, cynical spike of pity for the Duke. He was 30 years old, rich enough to buy half of Scotland, and utterly trapped. His father had died 6 months ago, leaving the estate in a mess of debt and unfulfilled contracts. Alaric had been dragged back from a quiet life in the country to play the prized bull in the ring. The Dowager was hunting for a wealthy, compliant daughter-in-law to balance the ledgers and breed heirs. Alaric stopped. He looked around the room. His eyes were dark, tired, and thoroughly annoyed. Then his gaze snagged on the alcove. On Alice. She froze. The lemonade sloshed dangerously close to the rim of her glass. "Don't look at me," she thought. "I'm wearing plum. I'm blending into the damask." He didn't look away. Instead, he abruptly turned his back on Lady Abernathy. He stepped around a startled footman, his heavy boots making dull, solid thuds against the polished oak floorboards. He was walking straight toward her. Alice panicked. She looked left and right. There was nowhere to go. The wall was at her back. He stopped directly in front of her. Up close, he was even larger. He smelled of rain on heavy wool starch and a faint, bitter trace of tobacco. He was breathing hard, the white linen of his shirt shifting against his chest. "You," he said. His voice was a low, rough baritone that grated against the shrill chatter of the room. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. Alice blinked. "Your Grace, are you currently promised for the next dance?" he asked, not looking at her face but checking over his shoulder. I am... No. But... Good. He thrust his hand out. It was encased in a white kid glove, but she could see the sheer size of his knuckles beneath the thin leather. Dance with me. It wasn't a request. Alice stared at his hand. I don't think that is a wise idea, Your Grace. I'm not looking for wisdom. I'm looking for a shield. He turned his head slightly, and Alice followed his line of sight. Through the parting crowd, the Dowager Duchess had locked eyes with her son. Her expression was perfectly neutral, which made it all the more menacing. Next to the Dowager stood Lady Caroline, a girl with a fortune in shipping and the intellectual depth of a soup spoon. Lady Caroline was smiling, waiting. May, if I don't walk onto that floor in the next 10 seconds? Alaric said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My mother will introduce me to that giggling infant, and I will be forced to ask her to dance. If I do that, the papers will have us married by Tuesday. Take my hand. Alice felt a spark of profound irritation. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was demanding a service. Because she was a nobody. Because dancing with Alice Somerset was so entirely non-threatening to his matrimonial prospects that it would stall his mother without causing a scandal. She should say no. She wanted to say no. But her corset pinched, her feet hurt, and the sheer unadulterated annoyance radiating from the Duke of Rothbury was the most genuine thing she had encountered all season. With a tight, thin sigh, Alice set her lemonade glass on a passing waiter's tray. She placed her gloved hand in his. If you step on my gown, Your Grace, she said softly, I will not hesitate to kick you. The corner of his mouth twitched. Duly noted. He didn't offer his arm. He simply wrapped his large hand around hers and towed her out of the alcove, pulling her into the harsh, glaring center of the ballroom, just as the orchestra struck the opening chords of a waltz. The floor was sticky. Someone had spilled sweet wine near the center of the room, and Alice's kid leather slippers made a faint, pathetic tearing sound every time she shifted her weight. Alaric turned to face her. He didn't bow. He just stepped into her space, closing the distance between them with the blunt efficiency of a man who wanted a chore done quickly. He placed his right hand on the side of her waist. Alice stiffened. His hand was too large. It spanned from the ridge of her ribs down to the flare of her hip. Through the thick plum silk of her dress, she felt the oppressive, startling heat of his palm. She placed her left hand on his shoulder. The wool of his coat was coarse, the muscle beneath it dense and unyielding like carved wood. They were standing too close. The waltz dictated a respectable distance, a polite pocket of air between partners. Alaric ignored it. He stood barely 6 inches from her, forcing her to tilt her chin up sharply, just to look at him. You are holding me too tightly, she said, her voice tight. If I hold you loosely, my mother will think I'm bored, and she will intercept us the moment the music stops. He replied, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere above Alice's head. The orchestra swelled. A shrill violin cut through the heavy air, and they moved. He was not a graceful dancer. He moved with a heavy marching rhythm, forcing Alice to follow his aggressive cadence. He didn't glide. He conquered the floorboard beneath him. She had to scramble slightly, her toes digging into the sticky wood to keep from being dragged. You are treating this like a military campaign, she snapped, wincing as he spun her sharply to the left. The sudden movement sent a sharp pain radiating from her ribcage where the corset dug in. It is a military campaign, he muttered. He looked down at her finally. His eyes were a startling muddy hazel, heavily lashed and framed by dark circles of exhaustion. Do try to look pleasant. You look as though I'm dragging you to the gallows. You dragged me out of a perfectly quiet alcove so you could hide from your mother, Alice retorted. She was tired of whispering. The music was loud enough to cover her words. I am not here to flatter your ego, Your Grace. I am rendering a service, and doing a remarkably poor job of it considering my feet are currently bearing the brunt of your lack of rhythm. Alaric paused for a fraction of a second, his heavy boots stumbling over the beat. A genuine look of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a scowl. I have excellent rhythm, he grunted, yanking her out of the path of a swirling couple. You walk like a man trying to kill beetles on the rug, she said flatly. He gripped her waist harder, pulling her another inch closer. Her breasts brushed the stiff lapels of his coat. She sucked in a breath, a sudden unwanted jolt of panic and heat shooting through her chest. It wasn't desire. It was the shock of sheer physical mass pressing against her. This dance means nothing. She muttered, her voice trembling slightly. She hated that tremble. She compensated by deliberately stepping a half-inch forward, letting her heel catch the edge of his polished black boot. He didn't flinch. He didn't even break stride. He just looked down at her, his jaw set, and pulled her impossibly closer. She could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart against her collarbone. His breath was hot, smelling faintly of brandy brushing against her temple. "Tell that to my mother watching," he said, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated against her ribs. Alice couldn't help it. She looked. Past Alaric's broad shoulder at the edge of the dance floor stood the Dowager Duchess. The older woman hadn't moved. The crowd had naturally cleared a small radius around her, sensing the danger. Augusta Penhaligon was watching them. Her cold, pale eyes were locked onto Alice's hand where it rested on Alaric's shoulder. Alice felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. "She looks like she wants to have me quietly poisoned." "She probably does." Alaric agreed, spinning them again. This time his grip was firmer, more controlled. He absorbed her misstep and forced her back into the rhythm. "You're ruining her evening. She spent 3 weeks arranging for Lady Caroline to be standing precisely at that spot at precisely 11:45. Then you should have danced with Lady Caroline." "Well, Lady Caroline asked me what my favorite breed of pony was." Alaric said, his tone devoid of inflection. Alice choked on a surprised, unladylike bark of laughter. She clapped her free hand over her mouth, her eyes widening. Alaric looked down at her, and for the first time the rigid, angry set of his mouth softened. It wasn't a smile. It was barely a relaxing of the muscles, but it changed his entire face. The heavy exhaustion lifted for a second. "Exactly," he said. Alice cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. She dropped her hand from her mouth and placed it back in his. "Well, you have successfully avoided ponies. But what is your plan for when the music stops? You cannot hold me hostage all night." "I haven't thought that far ahead." "You are a terrible strategist." "I am a desperate man, Miss—" He trailed off, realizing he didn't even know her name. The absurdity of it hit Alice. They were clutching each other in the middle of a crowded ballroom, sweating, arguing under the murderous gaze of his mother, and they hadn't even been introduced. "Somerset," she said dryly. "Alice Somerset." "Well, Miss Somerset." Alaric set his hand, sliding slightly on her waist, as they turned, the friction generating a sudden uncomfortable heat through the silk. "I apologize for the bruising you will undoubtedly discover tomorrow, and for dragging you into my family's madness." "Apology accepted," she said. "If you step on my foot again, I'm going to knee you in the groin." Alaric stared at her. Slowly, a low, rumbling sound started in his chest. It took Alice a moment to realize the Duke of Rothbury was laughing. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic chuckle. It was a rough, scraping sound, entirely inappropriate for the setting. Several couples nearby turned to stare. Alice felt her face burn. "You are attracting attention," she hissed, trying to pull back. He didn't let her go. "Let them look," he said, still smiling, a real crooked smile that made him look recklessly young for a fleeting second. "It sells the illusion." He spun her one last time, a dizzying, forceful turn, just as the final chord of the waltz crashed through the room. They stopped. Alice was panting, her chest heaving against the tight confinement of her corset. Her hair, carefully pinned up by her sister 3 hours ago, had begun to fall, a damp curl clinging to the side of her neck. She felt bruised, hot, and strangely awake. Alaric stood over her, breathing heavily as well. He didn't immediately release her waist. For a long, dangerous second, his thumb stroked the stiff silk just above her hip bone. Alice froze. The casual, almost unconscious intimacy of the gesture sent a shock of pure, terrifying electricity straight down her spine. She looked up, her breath catching. His eyes widened slightly, as if he had just realized what his hand was doing. He dropped his arm, abruptly stepping back and severing the connection. The cold air of the ballroom rushed into the space between them, chilling the sweat on Alice's skin. He offered his arm. His expression had slammed shut, returning to the grim, tired mask of the Duke. "Thank you, Miss Somerset," he said formally, his voice loud enough for the nearby gossips to hear. Alice placed her trembling fingers on his rough sleeve. "You are welcome, Your Grace." The walk back to the perimeter of the room felt infinitely longer than the walk to the center. The social temperature of the Abernathy ballroom had drastically shifted. When Alice had stood in the alcove, she was part of the wallpaper. Now, as she walked on the arm of the Duke of Rothbury, the man who had just publicly shunned an heiress to laugh with a nobody in plum silk, she was the blazing sun. Whispers broke out like small fires behind fans. Alice kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She could feel the hostile glares of mothers who had spent thousands of pounds outfitting their daughters, only to be upstaged by a tired 26-year-old with a muddy hem. Alaric walked beside her, stiff and unyielding. The brief moment of humor had vanished entirely. He was a fortress again, staring straight ahead, ignoring the murmurs. "Where would you like me to deposit you?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Back where you found me would be fine," Alice muttered. "Or anywhere in the shadows. I believe I've had enough visibility for one lifetime." "You handled it well," he said gruffly. "I survived it," she corrected. "There is a difference." They were 10 yards from the alcove when the crowd suddenly parted with unnatural speed. The murmuring died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Standing directly in their path was the Dowager Duchess of Rothbury. Up close, Augusta Penhaligon was even more intimidating. She was small, barely reaching Alaric's shoulder, but she possessed a gravitational pull that demanded absolute submission. Her skin was the color of old parchment pulled tight over sharp, aristocratic bones. She leaned on an ebony cane with a silver wolf's head handle, though Alice suspected she didn't actually need it for support. Alaric stopped. He didn't drop Alice's arm, though she felt the muscles in his forearm go rigid as iron. "Alaric," the dowager said. Her voice was surprisingly soft, like silk dragging over a blade. "Mother," Alaric replied, his voice flat. The dowager's pale, watery eyes slid slowly from her son to Alice. She didn't blink. She looked at Alice's hair, noting the stray curl. She looked at her flushed face. She looked at the cheap plum silk of her gown. She catalogued every flaw, every missing penny of wealth, and dismissed her entirely in the span of 3 seconds. "You seem to have forgotten our arrangement," the dowager said to Alaric, ignoring Alice completely. "Lady Caroline is waiting in the blue drawing room. She found the ballroom too stifling." "I found Lady Caroline stifling," Alaric said bluntly. Alice winced inwardly. Subtlety is not his strong suit. The dowager's jaw tightened. "Do not be vulgar, Alaric. You have obligations. Wandering off to amuse yourself with—" She paused, letting the silence hang heavy, a deliberate insult to the woman standing right in front of her. "Acquaintances is not how a duke conducts his affairs." Alice felt a hot flush of anger burn away her anxiety. She was tired, her feet hurt, and she was done being treated like a prop by this family. Before Alaric could speak, Alice gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. "I assure you, Your Grace," Alice said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, "the Duke was not amusing himself. He was merely doing his civic duty." The dowager's eyes snapped to Alice. The older woman looked genuinely startled that the acquaintance had spoken. "Civic duty, yes?" Alice said, smoothing the front of her ruined dress. "I was feeling faint from the heat. The Duke, being a gentleman, offered to guide me through the crowd so I wouldn't collapse and ruin Lady Abernathy's floorboards. It was entirely charitable. You must be very proud of his manners." Alaric coughed. It sounded suspiciously like a choked laugh turned into a throat clearing. The dowager narrowed her eyes. She leaned slightly forward on her cane. "And who exactly are you?" "Alice Somerset, Your Grace, daughter of the late Lord Henry Somerset." "Somerset." The dowager rolled the name around in her mouth like a bad oyster. "I knew your father. He had a profound lack of judgment regarding investments. It was a low blow, a brutal public reminder of the ruin that had left Alice's family penniless and scrambling on the fringes of society. Alice felt a cold knot form in her stomach, but she forced her chin up. She refused to look away. "My father had many faults." "Your Grace," Alice said, her voice dropping to a cool, hard pitch, "but he never lacked for manners. If you will excuse me." She gave a brief, perfectly executed curtsy, not to the dowager, but to Alaric. "Thank you for the charity, Your Grace," she said to him, her eyes flashing. "I will manage on my own from here." She turned her back on the Duke of Rothbury and his terrifying mother pushing her way into the crowd. She didn't look back. Behind her she heard the sharp thud of the dowager's cane against the floor. "Well," Augusta's voice drifted over the noise, laced with something that sounded dangerously like intrigue. "She is entirely unsuitable, but at least she isn't a pony." Alice walked faster, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She needed a dark room. She needed to loosen her corset. She needed to wash the smell of rain wool and Alaric Penhaligon off her skin. She reached the edge of the hallway, slipping past a group of gossiping lords. She thought she was free, until she felt a heavy hand close gently but firmly around her elbow. She stopped, turning around with a furious retort on her lips. Alaric stood there. He had abandoned his mother in the middle of the room. The crowd was staring at them in open, slack-jawed shock. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked entirely terrifyingly awake. "Miss Somerset," he said, his voice low, vibrating with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I believe you dropped something." "I have nothing to drop, Your Grace," she whispered, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes on them. He stepped closer, invading her space just as he had on the dance floor. The heat radiating off him was overwhelming. "You dropped me," he said bluntly, "and I find I am not quite finished being charitable." The hallway of the Abernathy house was suddenly too quiet. The orchestra in the ballroom had started a quadrille, a lively, bouncing tune that mocked the heavy, suffocating tension rolling off the onlookers. Lords with monocles and ladies hiding behind painted silk fans stared openly, their mouths forming small, scandalized circles. Alice stared at Alaric's hand on her elbow. His fingers were long, the knuckles wide, the grip entirely uncompromising. It wasn't a gentleman's light touch. It was a shackle. "Let go of me," she said. Her voice was steady, but her stomach was twisting into a hard, cold knot. "No." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The single word dropped between them with the density of lead. "You are making a spectacle," she hissed, glancing frantically at the whispering crowd. "You have already insulted an heiress and enraged your mother. Do not drag me further into your ruin." "My ruin is already absolute," Alaric replied flatly. "Yours, however, is merely financial. I can fix that. Walk with me." He didn't wait for her consent. He stepped forward, his sheer momentum forcing Alice to follow or risk falling over her own bruised feet. He steered her not toward the ballroom but toward the grand staircase leading to the front doors. "Where are we going?" she demanded, stumbling slightly as her heel caught on the edge of a Persian runner. "Out!" The footman at the bottom of the stairs scrambled backward as the Duke approached. Alaric didn't pause for his overcoat or his hat. He simply dragged Alice through the heavy mahogany doors and out into the biting chill of the London night. The contrast was violent. Inside, the air had been a swamp of lavender water and body heat. Outside, it was sharp, damp, and smelled heavily of horse manure, wet cobblestones, and the approaching rain. The sudden drop in temperature hit Alice like a physical blow. She gasped, her bare shoulders rising as a violent shiver racked her frame. The plum silk of her gown was utterly useless against the wind. Alaric stopped on the top step. He looked down at her, registering the shiver. Without a word, he unbuttoned his dark evening coat, shrugged it off his massive shoulders, and threw it around her. It was heavy. The wool was thick and still retained the intense radiating heat of his body. It smelled deeply of that bitter tobacco-starched linen and the faint metallic tang of sweat. It drowned her, the hem dragging on the wet stone, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. I don't want this." Alice said, her teeth chattering as she tried to shrug it off. He clamped a hand over the collar, holding the coat firmly shut around her throat. "Do not be an idiot, Miss Somerset. You will catch your death in that ridiculous dress, and I cannot have my only tactical advantage dying of pneumonia." Before she could process the sheer arrogance of the statement, a massive black carriage pulled up to the curb. The crest on the door was rendered in subdued gold, the Rothbury coat of arms. The driver bundled in a heavy waterproof cape, tipped his hat without looking directly at them. Alaric opened the door himself, ignoring the footman who hurried down the steps. "Get in." "I most certainly will not," Alice said, backing up. "I will walk, or find a hack." "You have no money for a hack," Alaric said brutally. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation delivered with the same flat tone he might use to note the weather. "And it is a 3-mile walk to your boarding house in Bloomsbury. Get in the carriage." Alice froze. "How do you know where I live?" "I know the Somerset debts. I know exactly what your father left you, which is precisely nothing minus the outstanding loans to my father's estate." Alaric leaned closer. In the flickering yellow light of the carriage lamps, his face looked carved from granite. "Get in, Alice." The use of her Christian name felt like a slap. It stripped away the thin veneer of societal protection she clung to. He wasn't the Duke of Rothbury addressing Miss Somerset. He was a desperate man cornering a tired woman. She looked at the dark, yawning interior of the carriage. She looked back at the Abernathy front doors where a few brave souls had stepped out onto the portico to watch the scandal unfold. Her feet throbbed. The cold was seeping through her thin slippers. With a bitter, exhausted sigh, Alice hiked up the hem of her plum dress, gathered the heavy folds of the Duke's coat around her waist, and climbed into the carriage. Alaric followed, instantly pulling the door shut behind him with a solid, echoing thud that severed them from the rest of the world. The interior smelled of rich oiled leather and coal dust. It was pitch black, save for the fleeting bars of street lamp light that slashed through the window as the carriage lurched into motion. Alice huddled in the corner, pulling her knees together. She felt entirely unmoored. The springs of the carriage squeaked a high, irritating sound beneath the rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone. Alaric sat opposite her. He took up too much space in the dark. He was a massive heat-generating shadow breathing slowly and heavily in the confined cabin. He had left his coat on her, and without it, he was just a man in a white linen shirt and a waistcoat, the informal state of his dress feeling obscenely intimate in the dark. They rode in total silence for 10 minutes. The carriage rattled over a particularly deep rut, and Alice was thrown slightly forward. "You said I was a tactical advantage," she said to the darkness. Her voice sounded small, and she hated it. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Explain." Alaric shifted. The leather seat groaned in protest. "My mother has given me an ultimatum. Marry Lady Caroline by the end of the season, or she will leverage the remainder of my father's unentailed properties to stall the debt payments. She wants me completely dependent on Caroline's fortune. She wants a leash. And what do I have to do with this?" "You insulted her." There was a dark, dry amusement in his voice now. "No one insults Augusta Penhaligon. You looked her in the eye and mocked her entirely. It was the most remarkable thing I have seen since I returned from Yorkshire." "I was annoyed," Alice muttered. "It wasn't a calculated political maneuver." "Which makes it even better," Alaric replied. "She will hate you. She already hates you for being penniless, but now she hates you for being insolent." "I am thrilled to be of service," Alice snapped. "But this still doesn't explain why you have kidnapped me in your carriage." "I haven't kidnapped you. I'm escorting you home." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. His face drifted into a shard of light from a passing pub. He looked exhausted. The deep lines bracketing his mouth were stark. "I need a distraction, Miss Somerset. I need a woman so thoroughly unsuitable, so aggravatingly present, that my mother will expend all her energy trying to destroy our acquaintance, rather than forcing me to the altar with Caroline. I need time to untangle my father's ledgers and find the money myself. You are going to buy me that time." Alice stared at him. The sheer transactional coldness of the proposition was breathtaking. He wasn't trying to seduce her. He was trying to hire her. You want me to act as bait. I want you to act as a shield, he corrected softly, just as you did tonight. And if I refuse, then I drop you at your door and we never speak again. Alaric sat back, melting into the shadows. But you won't refuse, because your landlord has threatened to evict you and your sister by the end of the month, and winter is coming. Alice's breath hitched. A cold, humiliating sweat broke out across her collarbones. He knew everything. The desperate penny pinching, the watered-down milk, the sheer terror of opening the door to find the bailiffs waiting. You are a bastard, she whispered. Yes, Alaric agreed into the dark. But I am a bastard who pays his debts. Help me, and I will clear yours. The morning sun did not grace the Somerset house with light. It merely exposed the grime. Alice sat at the small, scarred kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that tasted vaguely of tin. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, which wasn't saying much. Drafts whistled through the ill-fitting window frames, rattling the cheap, cracked panes of glass. The air smelled of damp plaster and the sharp, acrid scent of burnt toast. You're not eating, Harriet observed. Alice's younger sister, Harriet, was 22, but looked much older. Poverty had sharpened her features, turning what should have been a soft, pretty face into something haunted and hollow. She was scraping the charred edges off a piece of bread with a dull butter knife, the scraping sound setting Alice's teeth on edge. I'm not hungry, Alice said, rubbing her temples. A vicious headache hammered behind her eyes, the delayed consequence of the cheap wine at the Abernathy ball and the sheer adrenaline of the carriage ride. Harriet stopped scraping. She looked at Alice, her pale blue eyes taking in the dark circles, the pale skin, and the heavy, expensive man's coat that was currently draped over the back of the only armchair in the parlor next door. Alice hadn't known what to do with it. She couldn't very well hand it back to the Duke in the middle of the street at 2 a.m, so she had dragged it inside where it now sat like a massive dark accusation in their shabby home. Mrs. Higgins from across the street said a ducal carriage dropped you off last night. Harriet said quietly. She said you were wearing a man's coat. Mrs. Higgins should sleep more and spy less, Alice muttered, taking a sip of the terrible tea. Is it true, Bee? Harriet's voice trembled slightly. Did something happen? Alice looked at her sister's terrified face. Harriet didn't think Alice had found a suitor. She thought Alice had been ruined. In their world, a penniless woman stepping out of a duke's carriage at 2 a.m. meant only one thing, and it wasn't romance. It was desperation. Nothing happened, Alice said firmly, setting the cup down. The Duke of Rothbury required a favor. I provided it. He escorted me home, that is all. Dukes do not ask for favors from people like us. This one does. Alice closed her eyes. The memory of the carriage ride, the smell of leather, the dark, heavy weight of his gaze, the brutal arithmetic of his proposal played on a loop in her mind. Help me and I will clear yours. It was a staggering sum of money, enough to pay off their father's disastrous mining investments, enough to move to a smaller, cleaner house in a safer borough, enough to buy Harriet a new dress that wasn't patched at the elbows. All she had to do was let a terrifying old woman hurl insults at her for a few months and pretend to tolerate a man who moved like a siege engine. Before Alice could explain further, a heavy, sharp knock rattled the front door. It wasn't the polite, tentative tap of a neighbor. It was a knock that expected immediate compliance. Harriet jumped, dropping the butter knife with a clatter. Is it the landlord? She whispered, her eyes wide with panic. It's only Tuesday. Rent isn't due until Friday. Stay here, Alice said, pushing herself up from the table. Her feet still ached fiercely, the blisters from her dancing slippers rubbed raw. She limped slightly as she walked down the narrow, unlit hallway to the front door. She didn't bother to check her hair or smooth her faded morning wrapper. If it was the landlord, he didn't care what she looked like. He only cared about the coin. She pulled the deadbolt back and yanked the door open. Alaric Penhaligon filled the doorframe. In the harsh gray light of the London morning, he looked even rougher than he had the night before. He wasn't wearing evening clothes. He wore heavy riding boots caked with fresh mud-buff breeches and a dark green coat that looked well-worn and completely indifferent to current fashion. He held a leather riding crop in one hand, slapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He didn't look like a duke calling upon a lady. He looked like a bailiff coming to collect. He stopped slapping the crop. His muddy hazel eyes swept over her, taking in the faded cotton wrapper, the unpinned mess of her dark hair, the shadows under her eyes, and the cramped, peeling hallway behind her. Alice felt a sudden violent surge of shame. It was one thing to tell him she was poor, it was another for him to stand on a rotted threshold and smell the burnt toast. She tightened her grip on the door instinctively, trying to block his view of the interior. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with ice to cover the heat in her cheeks. "You are entirely too large for my porch. What do you want?" "I have come for my coat," Alaric said. Alice stared at him. "You came all the way to Bloomsbury at 9 in the morning for a coat?" "I am remarkably attached to it." He didn't smile. He stepped forward, forcing Alice to either step back or be trampled. She stepped back. Alaric crossed the threshold. The small house seemed to shrink instantly. His broad shoulders barely cleared the width of the hallway. He looked around, his gaze merciless as it catalogued the water stains on the ceiling and the worn threads of the carpet. "You shouldn't be here," Alice said, her heart hammering an uncomfortable jagged rhythm against her ribs. "If Mrs. Higgins sees you—" "Mrs. Higgins is currently busy watching my footman carry a basket of hothouse peaches and 3 heavily cured hams up your steps." Alaric interrupted smoothly, walking past her into the tiny parlor. Alice spun around. "You brought hams, Mum. I am told it is polite to bring a gift when calling upon a lady. My mother suggests flowers. I find flowers entirely useless for sustenance." Alaric stopped in the center of the parlor. He saw his heavy black coat draped over the armchair. He didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he turned to face her. "Have you considered my proposal, Miss Somerset?" Alice crossed her arms defensively over her chest. The air in the room was suddenly thick, charged with the same bizarre, grating energy they had shared on the dance floor. "It is an insane proposal," she said. "If we pretend to court, your mother will destroy my reputation entirely. She will dig up every unpaid bill, every scandal my father ever caused, and print it in the morning papers." "I know," Alaric said. "That is precisely the point. The louder she screams about you, the less she is thinking about Caroline's dowry." "And what happens when you finally fix your ledgers?" Alice demanded, stepping closer, her anger overriding her shame. "What happens when you drop the farce? I will be the woman who tried to trap a duke and failed. I will be unmarriageable. I will be ruined." "You are already unmarriageable and ruined," Alaric stated. It wasn't cruel. It was just a fact laid out on the table like a butcher's bill. "You are 26, living in a drafty box, eating burnt bread. What exactly are you trying to preserve?" Alice pried. The bluntness of it stole the breath from her lungs. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to scream. But mostly she wanted a slice of the ham he had left on the porch. The silence in the parlor stretched heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the frantic, uneven ticking of the cheap clock on the mantel. Alice stared at the man standing in her ruined home. He was a creature of immense power and wealth, yet he looked utterly trapped. The dark circles beneath his eyes were bruised and purple in the daylight. He was a man drowning, offering a lifeline to someone already at the bottom of the ocean. "Pride is the only thing my father didn't gamble away," Alice said softly. The anger had drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. "It keeps the cold out better than you think." Alaric's jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek ticked. He looked at the peeling wallpaper, then back at her. For a moment, the impenetrable, cynical armor he wore seemed to crack. "I cannot afford pride," he said, his voice dropping into a harsh, grating rasp. "I have 200 tenants in Yorkshire who will freeze this winter if I do not secure the funds to repair their cottages. I have a sister whose dowry my father secretly leveraged to buy a useless silver mine in Cornwall. My estate is bleeding to death, and my mother's solution is to sell me to the highest bidder." He took a step toward her. Alice didn't retreat this time. She stood her ground, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Miss Somerset." Alaric continued, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "I'm not asking for your heart, or your virtue, or your affection. I'm asking for your brass. I need someone who will not flinch when Augusta Penhaligon bares her teeth. I flinched last night." Alice pointed out, her voice barely a whisper. "You insulted her to her face and walked away. That is not a flinch. That is an act of war." A strange, dark thrill ran through Alice's chest. It was terrifying. It was madness. But it was the first time in 6 years someone had looked at her and seen something other than a pathetic charity case. He saw a weapon. The terms— Alice said, her voice shaking slightly. She forced herself to clear her throat and speak louder. "If we do this, I have terms." Alaric's eyes narrowed. The tension in his shoulders eased a fraction, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a predator scenting blood. "Name them." "You will pay off the outstanding debt my father owed to the Rothbury estate immediately. The paper will be burned." "Done." "You will establish a discreet line of credit at a grocer and a coal merchant in Bloomsbury for my sister Harriet. She is not to know it comes from you. I will not have her feeling beholden." Alaric nodded once. "Acceptable. And your wardrobe?" "My wardrobe is none of your business." "It is my business if you're to be seen on my arm in Hyde Park." Alaric countered bluntly. "You cannot fight my mother wearing a dress that looks like a bruised plum. You need armor." Alice's pride flared. "I will not accept gowns from a man. I am not your mistress." "You are my employee," Alaric corrected without missing a beat. "And employees require a uniform. You will go to Madame Vionnet on Bond Street. An account has already been opened in your name. If you do not use it, I will personally go there, select the most garish, offensive yellow silks I can find, and have them delivered to this address." Alice stared at him in disbelief. "You are an impossible man. I am a practical man." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. He tossed it onto the small side table. It landed with a solid thud. "That is the deed to your father's debt. It is yours. Do what you will with it." Alice looked at the envelope. It represented freedom. It represented a night of sleep without the terror of the bailiff's knock. She reached out with trembling fingers and picked it up. It felt impossibly heavy. She looked back up at Alaric. "How long?" "Until the end of the season. 2 months. If I cannot restructure the debt by then, I will surrender and marry Caroline, but until then you are mine to parade." "I am not a show pony, Your Grace." "No." Alaric agreed, a sudden dark smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "You are much too ill-tempered for that." He stepped past her, scooping his heavy evening coat off the chair. He draped it over his arm and walked back toward the door. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a polite farewell. He stopped with his hand on the brass knob and looked back over his shoulder. "Be ready tomorrow at 4 o'clock, Miss Somerset. We're going riding in the park." "And Alice?" She bristled at the familiar use of her name again. "Yes, Your Grace." "Eat the ham." He opened the door and walked out, leaving the house, feeling suddenly inexplicably empty. Alice stood in the parlor holding the envelope, the faint smell of wet mud and tobacco lingering in the damp air, overriding the scent of burnt toast. The machinery of the marriage mart had not ground her to dust. Instead, she had just climbed inside the gears. Madame Vionnet's shop on Bond Street smelled of expensive dust rosewater and profound snobbery. When Alice had first walked in, wearing a mended wool pelisse over her faded day dress, the shopgirls had looked at her as though she had tracked mud onto their pristine Aubusson carpets. Madame Vionnet herself had stepped out from the back room, her mouth already forming the polite, icy dismissal reserved for the destitute. Then Alice had handed over the card bearing the Rothbury crest. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and entirely nauseating. The icy dismissal melted into a frantic, groveling desperation. Suddenly, Alice was not a nuisance. She was a mannequin for the Duke's vast wealth. "We must emphasize the youth, mademoiselle," Madame Vianney had cooed, holding up a swath of pale pink silk against Alice's pale face. "Something sweet, to soften." "I do not want to look sweet," Alice had said, pushing the pink silk away. The fabric clung to her calloused fingertips. She looked around the shop, her eyes scanning the bolts of heavy fabrics until she found it. That one. It was velvet. A dark, stormy slate gray that bordered on black with the dull, rich sheen of a thunderhead. It was not the color of a blushing bride. It was the color of a battleship. Now, standing in her cramped bedroom in Bloomsbury, Alice stared at herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand. The riding habit fit flawlessly, a masterpiece of tailoring, achieved in less than 24 hours through sheer intimidation and Rothbury coin. The velvet was heavy, anchoring her to the floorboards. The bodice was tailored so sharply it felt like a second ribcage, forcing her spine completely straight. The tailored sleeves ended in stark white linen cuffs, matching the crisp cravat at her throat. A small dark gray top hat sat at a slight angle on her head, a veil of netting pinned back. She didn't look like Alice Somerset, the girl who watered down milk to make it last the week. She looked sharp. She looked dangerous. She walked to the window and pushed aside the moth-eaten curtain. Down in the street, Alaric was waiting. He was mounted on a massive bay gelding that looked as ill-tempered as its rider. He held the reins of a second horse, a sleek black mare equipped with a leather side saddle. He wore a dark riding coat and a severe top hat that cast his eyes into deep shadow. A few neighborhood children had gathered on the pavement, staring in wide-eyed silence at the sheer, terrifying spectacle of a duke loitering in front of a peeling door. Alice turned away from the window, pulling on her soft gray leather gloves. Her stomach roiled, a toxic mixture of dread and a bizarre nervous energy. When she opened the front door, Alaric turned his head. He didn't speak immediately. His gaze dropped from the small hat down the severe cut of the slate velvet bodice to the hem of the heavy skirt pooling over her boots. The silence stretched, broken only by the snort of the black mare and the jingle of a silver bit. "I told them to send yellow," he said finally. His voice was a flat, rough rasp. "I am not a canary, your grace," Alice replied, stepping down onto the pavement. The cold afternoon air bit at her cheeks, but the velvet held the chill at bay. "If I am to be your human shield, I require proper plating." Alaric's mouth twitched. It was a fleeting, microscopic break in his rigid expression. He tossed the mare's reins to a waiting groom and dismounted in one fluid, heavy motion. He walked toward her. Up close, the smell of clean horse sweat, saddle soap, and his ever-present bitter tobacco washed over her. He stopped a fraction of an inch too close, his large frame blocking out the gray afternoon light. "It serves the purpose," he muttered, looking down at her. He didn't wait for her to step toward the mounting block. He reached out and spanned her waist with both hands. The grip was startlingly firm, the heat of his palms bleeding straight through the thick layers of velvet and stays. Before Alice could gasp or protest, he lifted her off the pavement with effortless, terrifying strength and set her squarely into the side saddle. Alice scrambled to arrange her skirts, her face burning. She was breathless, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the stiff bodice. "You could have warned me." "We are behind schedule," Alaric said, turning his back and swinging up onto his own horse. He gathered his reins, his massive hands wrapping easily around the leather. He looked over at her, his hazel eyes cold and focused. "Keep your chin up, Miss Somerset. The slaughterhouse awaits." Hyde Park at 4 o'clock in the afternoon was not a place for recreation. It was an arena. The wide dirt path of Rotten Row was churned into a fine, choking dust by the hooves of 100 thoroughbreds. The air was a chaotic, overwhelming blend of expensive French perfumes, crushed grass, and horse manure. Carriages rolled by at a glacial pace, their occupants leaning out to nod, whisper, and surgically dismantle the reputations of everyone they passed. When Alice and Alaric rode through the Stanhope Gate, the noise seemed to drop by an octave. It started as a ripple. A lord in a high-perched phaeton reined his horses in, too sharply staring. A group of ladies in a landau abruptly stopped their shrill laughter. their parasols dipping as they leaned together to whisper. Alice felt the physical weight of their stares. It was a crawling sensation on the back of her neck. She tightened her grip on the reins, her knuckles turning white beneath the gray leather gloves. Her black mare shifted nervously, picking up on her rider's anxiety. Alaric maneuvered his large bay gelding closer until the toe of his polished riding boot brushed against the heavy velvet drape of her skirt. "Breathe," he ordered, not looking at her. He tipped his hat to a passing earl, his face a mask of bored, aristocratic indifference. "If you faint and fall off the horse, my mother wins." "I am not going to faint," Alice hissed through a rigid, forced smile. "I am simply assessing the enemy. There are too many to fight individually," Alaric said, adjusting his grip on his riding crop. "Just sit up straight and let the velvet do the work." They rode at a slow walk, a deliberate, agonizing parade. Alice kept her eyes fixed perfectly between her mare's ears. She heard snippets of conversation float through the dusty air like poisoned darts. "Somerset girl. Penniless, absolutely destitute. What is Rothbury playing at? Must be his new mistress." The word mistress hit Alice like a stone to the ribs. She flinched, the mare tossing her head in response. Alaric's hand shot out. He grabbed the bridle of Alice's mare close to the bit, steadying the animal instantly. He didn't let go. He kept his hand there, forcing his horse to walk in tandem with hers, their knees nearly touching. It was a blatant, highly improper display of physical proximity. "Let them talk," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble meant only for her. "A mistress is interesting. A mistress is dangerous. My mother cannot abide danger. I am not suited for this." Alice whispered, the panic finally bleeding into her voice. "I'm going to vomit on your boots." "You are perfectly suited for it," he countered roughly. "You are the only woman in this park who isn't trying to charm me into surrendering my title. Now smile at the Countess of Jersey. She's looking at us like we just crawled out of a sewer." Before Alice could process the instruction, the traffic on Rotten Row ground to a halt. Directly in their path, an open barouche carriage was blocking the lane. The horses were perfectly matched grays. The footman wore the black and gold livery of the Rothbury house. Sitting in the carriage, wrapped in sable against the autumn chill, was the Dowager Duchess. Next to her sat Lady Caroline, wearing a violently cheerful shade of canary yellow. Alice's stomach dropped into her boots. Alaric didn't pull back. He urged his horse forward until they were parallel with the carriage, forcing Alice to come with him. "Mother," Alaric said. His tone was perfectly level, devoid of any warmth. "Lady Caroline, a pleasant afternoon for a drive." Lady Caroline beamed, completely oblivious to the lethal tension radiating from the Dowager. "Oh, it is your grace. We were just discussing the swans. Have you seen the swans?" Augusta Penhaligon ignored the girl. Her pale reptilian eyes slid past her son and locked onto Alice. She took in the severe slate velvet, the pristine white cravat, the rigid posture. For a fraction of a second, Alice saw a flicker of genuine surprise in the old woman's eyes, followed immediately by absolute, unadulterated fury. "Miss Somerset," the Dowager said. Her voice cut through the background noise of the park like a silver knife. "I see you have found an alternative to the Abernathy alcoves, though I must confess I did not peg you for an equestrian. Horses are such an expensive hobby." The implication was clear, heavy, and public. Alice felt the heat rush to her face, but she forced the muscles of her back tighter against the corset. She remembered the hams on her porch. She remembered the crushing weight of her father's ledgers now safely burning in her kitchen hearth. She had nothing left to lose to this woman. Alice tilted her chin down slightly, looking at the Dowager from beneath the netting of her hat. "They are your grace." Alice replied, her voice cool, carrying the exact cadence of bored aristocracy she had spent her life mocking. "But thankfully his grace is an excellent judge of horseflesh. He insists that putting cheap tack on a quality animal is a false economy." Lady Caroline blinked, utterly confused. Alaric gave a short, sharp cough that did nothing to cover the sudden dark amusement in his eyes. The Dowager's jaw snapped shut. The skin around her mouth went white. Alice had just equated herself to a prized mare, effectively throwing Alaric's massive wealth in his mother's face while remaining perfectly technically polite. Indeed. Augusta managed her fingers tightening around the silver wolf's head of her cane until her knuckles cracked. Let us hope the animal doesn't throw him. Alaric has always been prone to reckless investments. I find reckless investments yield the highest returns, Mother, Alaric said smoothly. He tipped his hat. Good day, Caroline. He nudged his gelding forward, breaking the impasse. Alice followed, leaving the dowager's carriage eating their dust. They rode in silence for 50 yards. The tension in Alice's shoulders slowly began to uncoil, leaving her limbs feeling weak and hollow. She had done it. She had struck the beast on the nose and lived. Miss Somerset, Alaric said, not looking at her. Yes, Your Grace. Remind me never to play cards with you. The return to Bloomsbury was quieter. The gray light of the afternoon was rapidly bleeding into dusk, the street lamps flickering to life, casting long, wavering shadows across the cobblestones. The adrenaline that had sustained Alice in the park was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, aching fatigue. Her thighs burned from gripping the side saddle, and the heavy velvet habit felt like a lead weight pressing into her collarbones. Alaric pulled his gelding to a halt in front of her narrow, peeling door. The neighborhood was quiet, the children having been called in for supper. The only sound was the clop of the horse's hooves and the distant, mournful whistle of a train. Alaric dismounted. He handed the reins to his groom with a sharp nod, dismissing the man to wait at the corner. He walked over to Alice's side of the mare. She began to untangle her leg from the pommel, her muscles stiff and uncooperative. I can manage, Your Grace, she mumbled, wanting nothing more than to crawl out of the crushing corset and drink a cup of terrible tea. Don't be stubborn, he said, stepping into her space. He didn't wait for her permission. He reached up his large hands, closing around her waist just as they had outside Madame Vionnet's. But this time it was different. The cold air had seeped into the velvet, but his hands were burning hot through his leather riding gloves. He lifted her. Alice instinctively placed her hands on his shoulders to steady herself. The coarse wool of his coat scratched against her palms. He didn't set her down immediately. For a single agonizing second, her boots hovered an inch above the pavement. The slide of her velvet skirts brushed against the hard line of his thighs. She was trapped between his hands and the dark, unyielding mass of his chest. She looked down at him. The shadow of his top hat hid his eyes, but she could see the heavy clenched line of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble, the rapid pulse beating at the base of his throat above his cravat. He was breathing heavily, his chest expanding against her knees. The transactional nature of their arrangement, the ledgers, the hams, the mocking conversations in the park suddenly vanished. It evaporated into the damp London air, leaving only the brutal, terrifying reality of a man holding a woman in the dark. Alice's breath hitched. She felt a sudden violent jolt of heat pool low in her stomach. It wasn't the cynical appraisal of an employer. It was the sharp primal shock of desire. She hated it. She hated him for making her feel it. Put me down, she whispered. Her voice trembled, and there was no hiding it this time. Alaric froze, his head tilted up just a fraction. He was close enough that she could smell the faint tang of brandy on his breath. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her mouth. It was a microscopic shift in attention, but it felt as loud as a gunshot in the quiet street. His thumbs pressed harder into the curve of her waist, dragging a painful, choked gasp from her throat. Then the mask slammed back into place. The Duke returned, shutting away whatever desperate human thing had just looked at her. He set her on her feet. The impact jarred her achy joints, but he had already stepped back, severing the connection entirely. The cold air rushed in to fill the space between them. I will send the carriage for you tomorrow at 8, Alaric said. His voice was perfectly flat, completely devoid of the gravelly warmth it had held in the park. We are attending the opera. Alice took a step back toward her door, clutching her heavy skirts with shaking hands. The opera? Alaric, She stopped. The use of his Christian name slipped out naturally, a dangerous casualty of the moment they had just shared. Alaric's eyes flared a flash of muddy hazel in the dim light. He stared at her, his jaw working as if he wanted to speak to correct her, or perhaps to drag her back against him. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel. He grabbed his gelding's reins from the returning groom, swung himself up into the saddle without a word, and spurred the massive horse down the narrow street. Alice stood on the pavement alone, the chill finally cutting through the thick armor of her velvet habit. She watched his broad back disappear into the fog, realizing with a cold, sinking horror that she had survived the society matrons, but she was completely defenseless against the Duke himself. If you felt the incredible raw tension between Alaric and Alice in this installment, please hit that like button. Their fake courtship is starting to blur the lines of reality, and the stakes have never been higher. Share this video with your fellow romance lovers to help them discover this deeply human, cynical love story. What do you think will happen at the opera? Leave your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a chapter. See you in the next part.